So I'm here today at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum, and we're going to talk about an early airliner in the industry. And a lot of people think that this one behind me here, the DC-3, is really the beginning of the modern airline industry, but it wasn't. There was an aircraft before the DC-3 that ended up being significantly more important to modern aviation, and it wasn't even the DC-2 or the DC-1, and it was a Boeing aircraft that failed horribly. And I'm not talking about the 737 MAX, I'm talking about that over there, the Boeing 247, and that will be the topic of today's video. So the Boeing 247 that you see behind me introduced many of the modern technologies that we take for granted, not just in airliners, but in many modern aircraft. Stressed skin construction, cantilever wing, retractable landing gear, de-icing boots, trim tab, autopilots. That's all technologies that were spearheaded by this aircraft behind me, the Boeing 247. And the main reason why it became a commercial flop, it would be very easy for anyone to understand if you are aware of the concept of death by committee. So let's get right into this. We'll learn more about why this failed. Now you have to remember, this aircraft entered service only 9 years after the Ford Trimotor, and at the time, the Ford was still the main airliner in service for most of the world's airlines. The 247, however, was faster than the main U.S. aircraft fighter of the day, the P-12. The aircraft was initially designed as a 14-seat airliner using Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines, but United Airlines pilots, who were consulted, objected to the heavy weight of the aircraft and that many pilots would be overpowered by the larger Hornet engines, and requested the lower-powered Wasp to be installed. While the Pratt & Whitney chief engineer was sure that the Wasp would be outclassed in the near future, the company president gave in and the aircraft was redesigned with the Pratt & Whitney Wasp. This drop in engine power reduced the passenger load to 10, although it was still able to climb fully loaded on a single engine, which was a huge safety improvement over other commercial aircraft of the day. It is worth noting that Boeing and Pratt & Whitney were both part of the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation. This also included the later named United Airlines, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Antitrust laws eventually forced the corporation to split, with the airline becoming a separate entity, the Western members all rolled into Boeing Aircraft, and the Eastern companies becoming the United Aircraft Corporation, later United Technologies, which still exists today. This change in engines was one of two decisions that in the end doomed the 247. So now that the final design was set, the aircraft went into production. There was interest from a number of airlines, but being part of the United Aircraft Transport Corporation, Boeing's airline, aptly named Boeing Air Transport, later United Airlines, got dibs on the first production run, purchasing 60 aircraft off the drawing board. TWA also showed interest, but United Aircraft Transport Corporation declined the order because why would they sell to an airline competing against their own? This is why UATC was eventually broken up. The decision to block TWA's order is the second and most likely the main reason why the 247 eventually failed. Jack Fry, TWA's president, after being blocked from purchasing the 247, approached Douglas Aircraft and requested a comparable airliner. This resulted in the 12-passenger DC-1, which was put into production as the 14-passenger DC-2. The DC-2 entered service only 1 year after the 247, and having a 14-passenger capacity, along with the Wright Cyclone engine, made it basically what the 247 was supposed to have been. The DC-2 went on to be turned into the DC-3, which in the immediate post-war era went on to become the primary airliner for many airlines around the world. One significant drawback that severely limited the 247's ability to be turned into a cargo aircraft was a main spar that went through the cabin, as we can see here, where the DC-2 and DC-3 had a flat floor enabling the easy loading and unloading of cargo. Now, this may have been a good reason why the 247 was so quickly retired, as it did not have any ability to have a second lease on life, as similar to these other airliners. If Boeing had built the airliner they had wanted, with an eye on the future needs of the industry, and sold the aircraft to TWA instead of the short-sighted stick-it-to-the-competition design they made, they most likely would have had a world-beating aircraft on their hands, and things would have turned out very different. Instead, the DC-2 and later DC-3 went on to outsell the 247 by a large margin. There were only 75 247s built, while the DC-2 production run of 198, already a fair margin. The DC-3 and its modified military variant, the C-47, went on to a total production of roughly 10,800 units. Boeing would not break back into the airliner industry in any meaningful way until the 707 came out in the early 1950s. Now, it's worth noting that playing these what-if games can be a slippery slope, because if we look at things like history, while the 247 was a failure, Boeing went on to become a strong contender in the military market. They got into heavy bombers with things like the Model 299, which evolved into the B-17, which evolved into the B-29, evolved into the B-50. They got into things like the B-47 and the B-52 in the post-war years. They developed the 707 airliner, the Model 382, and it actually didn't end up, was it 382? The Dash 60 was the initial airliner, and it didn't end up going anywhere. Not a lot of airlines were interested. So it was marketed to the Air Force as a tanker, modified as such, and then was able to be modified and turned into a high-speed airliner once the it was proven to be a solid airframe. Now, that being said, Douglas went on with the success of the DC-3 and made a large number of airliners, the DC-4, the DC-6, the DC-7, and then into the jet age with the DC-8. Now, the opposite could be said. If things like the Boeing 247 became the success and the DC-1, 2, 3 series failed, maybe Douglas would have continued into the more of a military side of things and created combat aircraft instead of having their airliners converted into transports, and Boeing would have focused on the airliner side of things. So again, I don't like playing the what-if game, but you can clearly see here how the 247 geared Boeing away from commercial aircraft for a large number of years. So of the 75 Boeing 247s that were built, only 4 still exist. This one behind me, one at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, one at the Smithsonian on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and one in the Museum of Science and Industry in England. Now, this one behind me is actually the oldest of the 4 still in existence. This was only number 17 that rolled off the production line, so it is a pretty rare example. So the history of this airframe behind me is pretty interesting. I have the history written right here. So the airframe was built in 1933. It was upgraded to a 247D model in 1935. Now, its operational history includes some notable items, including flying with United Airlines, briefly with the RCAF as a trainer in 1940 and 1941. It was converted into a crop duster in the 1950s in Arizona. That's pretty cool for something this large. And it eventually ended up with the Standard Oil Company in California in 1959, which eventually became Chevron. In the US, it became Chevron. In Canada, Standard Oil was known as SO. So it was donated to the museum in 1967, and it does wear the exact same colors it did when it was retired in that year. So that's pretty cool. Really interesting history on this airframe behind me. So as you can see, the Boeing 247 is a classic example of a company building an ultra-modern airline for yesterday's needs. Now, it also shows why airline companies need to be cognizant of what is going to be required in the future and design a future-proof aircraft versus just building something for what is required today. I also would like to thank everybody out at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum for letting me shoot there, and I highly recommend a visit to anybody who happens to be or lives in the Ottawa area. All that being said, thank you for watching, and we'll see you all next time.